Good evening and welcome to NycosRPG. I'm Jonathan Albin and this is Game Master's Toolbox followed by Game Master's Soapbox, and ultimately we have also a section of creative differences to go over and around the world AD&D. We're going to be all over the place, hodgepodge. So today I want to thank you for being here. If you haven't yet, make sure you hit all the buttons, subscribe, like, all of that nonsense. Help us keep this a daily channel. And here we go. So we are talking about, in terms of toolbox, we're looking at distance, movement, and range. This is one of the subjects when it comes to role-playing games that at once feels very necessary and at the same time feels like a bit of overkill. We're going to be talking about why people use movement, distance, and range in their game sessions, and we're going to look at really what I've kind of boiled it down to with 50 years of experience behind the game shield. It's been a railroad ride as far as what people want to do, what people think they're going to do. It's been ups and downs and all abouts. So we're going to talk today about those, and in particular, make sure that you pay attention to the creative differences part, the round the world in 80 days part, because it'll help you to be able to use these tools, this conversation, in your personal games. All right, so let's get started. So when we are talking about using distance and range and movement in a game session, we need to first of all decide whether we are going to be using a physical location or whether it's an ongoing adventure, perhaps traveling by a sailing vessel or whatever. But you need to establish the scene. You need to have an idea of, so that the players can know how far in terms of distance that they will be traveling in the scene. You'll have an idea of the kinds of perhaps cover they might be able to take along the way. And all of these issues are very important to take into account. The second thing that you have to kind of take into account too is deciding what the vision parameters are. Is it clear skies and 1,000,000 miles of visibility and no clouds in the sky to interfere with night vision or whatever? The idea is that you have to decide what those vision parameters are and how you're going to utilize them. So for example, if you were talking about using fog, how close in is the fog? Is it a disparate fog that ebbs and flows, and therefore they might get a longer range view if they wait a while? You have to have all of these kind of things in place when you are using theater of the mind, and a lot of players prefer to use miniatures so that they simply can avoid this problem. But the reality is that there are reasons to play theater of the mind, and we're going to go into a few of them right now. And the first issue of theater of the mind is that even when you are using miniatures, you're only providing a support for the creativity of the imagination. Yes, you are not limited in your actions by seeing where the miniatures lie on the table, but having an idea of how far away you are from an opponent versus how many feet it's going to take to close to use a certain weapon style or weapon type, or how close what kind of danger you're going to be in before you can close that distance. These are all things that have to come up in play, and if you utilize the theater of the mind, you can do a little bit more deep feedback concerning these things because you can consider these virtually on the fly. Now, when we talk about combat, of course, you have to worry about the particular range of the weapons that are being used. For example, a axe in the hand is going to have a limited amount of range unless you want to hurl the weapon over a distance. And if you hurl it over a distance, it's obviously no longer with you, and so therefore you then have to close the distance to recover the axe. So the idea of knowing what the ranges are is very important. Now, if you are playing a rules as written game with a lot of very crunchy numbers, these can become tedious. So knowing that you can fire your bow at a 300-foot range, but you're better off at 60 meters having to do the math and trying to determine how close the opponent is, and all of that can add burdens to the combat system. Many of you know that when you are talking about using, for example, arrows, standard arrows in a classic D&D fight scene, you're going to be firing a lot of them in order to rank up any real damage to the opponent, since the arrows aren't traditionally listed as being that much damage. I mean, arguably, it's the same as a sword, but you're generally not going to get to add your strength bonus to it, or you're going to have a super modified weapon to allow for magical impact damage or something. But I've discovered that there's really functionally only 3 ranges you need to consider. And the ranges, first of all, are classifications of distance that determine which weapons can or cannot be used at that specific distance. So, for example, knowing that you have, with the variety of weapons that are available in Dungeons and Dragons, each of them having a staggered value tends to make it a little bit more crunchy and therefore a little bit more sophisticated to resolve. One of the biggest challenges to role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons is the fact that the combat system is famous for being relatively sloggy to start with, simply from the I swing, you swing ideology that develops when you play role-playing games. When you think of each of your successive attacks as being an individual action and move away from the abstract of it being so many seconds of action, you run into problems. And so what it's boiled down to in games that I run, and in particular is built into the rules of NycosRPG, is the idea that you have 3 fundamental ranges. You have melee combat, which is hand to hand. There is no range. And fundamentally, most ranged weapons are difficult to utilize in that circumstance. Now, I've seen plenty of videos that talk about using a bow in melee, and there are certain functionalities that can be done. But the idea of keeping them as 3 separate ranges really lets your character develop his own personal style. So the 3 fundamental ranges, as I mentioned, are ranged weapon range, which is just called ranged. Then you've got hurled weapons range, or throwing range. And then you have close or melee combat. And by having 3 stages, you can literally allow for things like an enemy charge to be represented as they close from those various ranges. And the reason why we have determined to do it this fashion is that when you're firing a weapon at a long range, the person has to cross quite a distance to go from ranged weapon maximum range all the way down to the range that you could throw something. So therefore, that's a lot of time. But archery does take a considerable amount of time, knocking the bow, raising the bow into range, and choosing a target. Add to that the fact that archery is not considered to be a combat action, generally speaking, because it takes that level of concentration and sophistication to put the arrow on target. Breaking it down this way means that, for example, if you have several persona in your group who are armed with ranged weapons, they can fire in each turn as long as the opponent hasn't achieved close combat. So therefore, mechanically, if they're on an absolute charge, they will get at least 1 attack at ranged weapon range, a second at hurled weapons range, and then have to switch weapons to engage the melee. Generally, I will allow 2 or maybe even 3 rounds of ranged combat, again defined by the setting and the established scene that I've developed in the beginning, and the players are aware of those numbers well in advance of it. So therefore, as I telegraph each turn's game state, I give them the details on, okay, well, you are aware of an opponent who is at more than ranged weapon range, and so you'll be able to fire on them as soon as they get within ranged weapon. And then again, I'll grant them a second round of ranged attack, and then finally a 3rd attack as the enemy enters hurled weapons attack. Of course, at that point, they may be facing inbound damage from the opponent who might be hurling things at them. But the point is, by having three simply defined ranges, then I can allow a panoply of weapons to be used at those particular ranges. Now, if a player argues that it's a heavier weapon and should be able to be used in melee or whatever, then maybe perhaps I would add to it, therefore it's slower and can only get one ranged weapon attack. But that's all microcosmic. The idea is that you at least get one attack at range, one attack at hurled, and then finally in close combat if they're charging into you, so that you've got 3 rounds of action. Add to that many times we utilize the Nikos mechanism, which provides winner or loser positioning based on relative dice rolling. There is a video on quantum die rolling. I'm going to attach it up here, so that should be available for you right there. That's the QDR spot. And then beyond that, there's also another section on the NycosRPG system in general, and that one is up here at position 2 will be the NycosRPG video. And so these 2 mechanisms will allow you to determine the success failure of your actions purely on success failure. So therefore, if you succeed with your archery and your opponent fails, you've cut them down at range. It doesn't necessarily mean you've killed them, but you certainly can convey conditions on them to either slow them down to give you an extra shot, perhaps, or you've done actual damage to them, or you've caused them to be injured and therefore have to reduce their move or something. You get to pick those conditions using the NycosRPG system. But having these 3 makes the system simple, and there really is a balance when you're talking about role-play games between being very simple and therefore playing through quickly and using very little in terms of sophistication to determine outcomes, or you can play it very, very sophisticated in terms of you've got to roll to hit. In some games, you have to, after you've rolled to hit, then the opponent gets to roll a defensive value to see whether or not your defense hits. And then once that's happened, then you deal with the damage, and then the damage can possibly affect their fatigue, and it becomes more and more complex and more long-winded, and therefore it's no wonder that a combat section in a combat situation in traditional role-play games can take considerable amounts of time compared to the speedy play system that we use with NycosRPG. So it really comes down to the situational experience of the persona in the scene to determine what range they are at from an opponent, how much movement they're going to have to expend to get there. And there's a lot that is built into the system that makes those decisions much more efficient. But the idea is that the players have to be able to be aware of what the situational condition is at every step of the way. And so it's important to remember to restate the game state at the beginning of each sequence of either combat or non-combat. And then finally realize that what the real power of the Nikos mechanism is that you can utilize the conditional agency aspect of NycosRPG. When you have made a success and the opponent has made a success of a lower value, then you can convey a condition into the battle that changes dynamically, whether they choose to finish the closing or whether they wish to cease at hurled weapons range or whatever. And so by having these agency advocations by the players, they feel like there's more energy to it. And the main thing is that with all of this, if you only utilize the 3 ranges, then the endings of those decisions can be understood. Yes, you're moving from outside of ranged weapon range into ranged weapon. Now you can fire your bows, take those combat action, blah, blah, blah. And then now we can move on to their continuing their pursuit, closing in on you. And therefore, at every phase, whenever you get to a success or a failure, you can understand, you can see it happening dynamically by being able to operate this all within the theater of the mind. Wow, I ripped through that pretty quickly. So before we go on, I want to thank you for being a part of the show. And if you want to be part of our community and be involved with the games that we play, check out patreon.com/Nykos. That is the doorway, if you will, to joining our Patreon and becoming a player in our Saturday and Sunday online games played through Discord. So for more information on that, you can also check out NycosRPG.com for our properties and NycosRPG.info for more about the game lore.